Alright guys, I'm not gonna lie, when I started running ads a few years ago, I thought to get to the point where you're spending $10,000 a day, you had to be like some super genius media buyer and you had to have all these complex systems and processes. And honestly now, having multiple clients that are spending over $10,000 a day, I understand that it's not really that hard to get to the point where you're spending $10,000 a day on ads. And obviously, if you're at the point where you're spending $10,000 a day on ads or $300K a month, your info product should be generating around, if not more, than $1 million a month. So in this video, I'm going to give you all the principles and the step-by-step process to essentially take your ads that already might be working at a smaller scale and scale them up to $10,000 a day in ad spend. So if that sounds good to you, let's get right into it. So yeah guys, in this video, we are going to be talking about everything that you need to know to scale your info products ads to 10K a day in ad spend. So whether you're at the point where you're spending like $1,000 a day, you're just starting to get comfortable with it, or if you've never ran paid ads for your info product before or for your client's info product before, and you just want to get comfortable with the entire thought process and everything it's going to take to scale, this video is going to be super helpful for you. So first, let's get into some context. So when it comes to even launching paid ads, it's already hard enough to generalize that just because everyone has a different situation. But scaling paid ads is even more contextual to your offer, and there are no one-size-fits-all answers. So if I give advice to one client, it might be completely different for the next client just because of their unique set of circumstances. But with that being said, everything in this video is going to be more so about principles that you should use to scale rather than binary, like go do this kind of advice. So if you want hands-on help with scaling your info product with paid ads and you want someone who's going to look at your exact situation and kind of prescribe you the exact approach, you know where to go. Just click the link down below and apply to work with us. But getting into the video, let's get into some prerequisites before we start talking about actually scaling. So the first thing that you need to be cognizant of is making sure that you're even trying to scale the right funnel. So every funnel has a certain percentage that relies on sales versus marketing in terms of the percentage odds of you seeing success. And it's important to understand this. Of course, like I'm not trying to say that these numbers are set in stone. It's just my kind of opinion, but your success with a call funnel is right about 50-50 in terms of like what percentage of it comes down to marketing, what percentage of it comes down to sales. I would say it's right around 50-50. DM ads, for example, are like 20% reliant on marketing and like 80% reliant on sales. Low ticket to high ticket is around 75% marketing and around 25% sales. Webinars, I would say, are around 60% marketing, 40% sales. The reason why I'm even mentioning this is because you need to have your expectations congruent with the funnel that you're trying to run, and you also need to pick the funnel that's probably going to have the highest probability of seeing results quickly. Like, for example, I was talking to one of my friends, and he's trying to crack an auto webinar right now, and he hasn't even cracked a call funnel for his offer yet. And basically, the logic I was walking him through is like, look, an auto webinar is like literally 95% marketing. And the thing is with like a call funnel is if you can give 40% of the control back to your sales team, which in this case, like his sales team was definitely his strength. What I'm trying to say is when you can kind of split the responsibility, it's like, okay, I can be doing my marketing side on the call funnel like at around a 8 or 9 out of 10, and then the sales side of it can be an 8 or 9 out of 10, and I'm going to see success with it. Whereas like with an auto webinar, it's like 95% on the marketer. It's like if the marketer isn't doing everything like almost 100% correctly, funnel's just not going to work. So that's kind of the logic that goes into choosing the funnel that you want to try and scale first. So ideally, you're scaling a funnel that aligns with your ICP and has a high probability to convert and leans into the strengths of your current situation. So I'll go back to my friend who I was talking about. So his ICP for this offer is like business owners, and he's trying to push them to an auto webinar where they have to sit down for 45 minutes and buy something at the end of it. So what I'm trying to say is that doesn't really align with the ICP. Like business owners are typically like on the go, kind of, give me the information I need and I'll decide whether or not it works for me or not. They're not necessarily the kind of people who want to sit down for 45 minutes in the middle of a day and watch an auto webinar. So I would say that that funnel doesn't really align with the ICP and thus doesn't have necessarily the highest probability to convert. And then also the second point in that, and I kind of already talked about this, is it needs to lean into the strengths of your current situation. So if you have a really good sales team, like by all means, put some of the responsibility in their court. Or if you don't have a sales team and it literally needs to be like majority on you, maybe look at something like doing a webinar, doing a low ticket to high ticket where you maybe just need like one closer who's just like adequate because the majority of the responsibility is on the marketing side. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so the next prerequisite is understanding that scaling paid ads isn't just about the ads. So unfortunately, you can do everything perfectly on the front end when it comes to like running your ads, everything you do in the ads manager, even everything you do on the funnels and the VSLs and everything, and you'll still get terrible results if your sales team isn't in check. So some kind of bullet points here. Obviously, I'm not a sales trainer. I'm not a sales manager. I'm not claiming to be that, but just kind of some of my experience is you need to set expectation with the sales team up front about the learning curve on these leads. So especially when, let's say, for example, your sales team is used to taking majority organic calls and now you're trying to scale your paid ads to the point where the majority of their calendar is going to be paid ads. You have to set expectations with them up front that this is going to be a bit of a learning curve for them and not to get frustrated, not to just start getting mad when leads don't show up or when leads don't show up properly framed, etc. The next thing is speed to lead is like a massive lever. So every single person who applies, qualified or unqualified, has to be getting called and texted within 10 minutes, absolutely non-negotiable. And this is something that, needs to be kept up with even more as you scale, because obviously your sales team is full of humans. So when humans have to deal with more volume and more lead flow, this might slack. So you need to be sure that's not slacking. And the next thing, which I'm kind of alluding to, is that you need to quality check everything on the sales team side. When it comes to pre-call text, automations, setter frameworks, scripts, closer scripts, etc., like you need to constantly be quality checking, or obviously have your sales manager quality check these things just to make sure that your systems are running as efficient as possible and you're really getting the most out of all of your ad dollars, especially as you scale. And then the last thing is, when we launch a new team, and especially even when we're scaling, I'm getting excessive amounts of feedback from the sales team, so I know what to change on the front end. So with that being said, you also might need to train your sales team about how to actually give helpful feedback because you want tight communication loops. So what I mean by that is, I don't really care if a lead is qualified or unqualified. I don't really care if they're dumb or if they're smart or whatever. I want like tangible feedback that I can use to go and change things on the front end. So I want to hear things like, hey, I've had a bunch of calls this week that don't understand this thing, or they have this misconception, or I feel like X, on the marketing side might be scaring people off, or I feel like we should potentially change the ICP that we're targeting to this kind of person. All of that is super helpful. It's just that most salespeople aren't necessarily trained on how to give feedback like that because they don't understand the kind of tango that has to happen between marketing and sales in order to see success at scale with paid ads. Okay, and the last prerequisite that I want to go over is kind of a mental model that is essentially talking about rigging the deck in your favor. So when you start running paid ads or when you start scaling paid ads, the thing that I want you to think about is that there is a lot of things that could potentially go wrong and essentially ruin your chance of being profitable. There's like the chance that your sales team is dropping the ball, or that the ads aren't targeting the right people, or that your VSL isn't good enough, or all these different things. And essentially what you have to do is it's almost like this fight. It's like this fight of you trying to become profitable and kind of all the things that might be wrong with your infrastructure keeping you unprofitable. So essentially what you need to do is you need to do everything within your power to kind of fight against all of these things that might be wrong within your approach to kind of rig your odds of success in your favor. And obviously over time, as you make the iterations, like this side of the equation starts to outweigh this side and you become more and more profitable. But what I'm trying to say is that you want to essentially do everything you can within your power to condense that learning curve as much as possible. So like these are little things, and there's obviously 100 other things I could talk about, but even things just like figuring out how to liquidate as much ad spend as you can. So whether that's selling like a low ticket offer or having your setters dial through all the DQs every single day and trying to reset them onto the calendar, things like that. Liquidating ad spend is obviously a big lever, just because if you can, let's say, liquidate 25 or 30% of your ad spend, which is kind of our goal for a lot of our teams, think about how much kind of wiggle room that gives you in terms of bidding when ad costs get higher, or like how much margin that adds to your P&L when you're able to recoup 20 or 30% of your ad spend. That's one thing. Another thing that kind of ties along with that is having a hungry and scrappy sales team. So like, for example, obviously you might have like a $5,000 program, and your goal is to be super profitable just running ads to that $5,000 program. But if you have like a $997 offer and you have a really hungry and scrappy sales team and they're constantly just selling $997s left and right, think about how much margin that gives you. And that kind of ties in with the first one of liquidating ad spend, but what I'm trying to say is that usually a big part in liquidating the ad spend isn't just having the offer, it's having the sales team that's actually hungry enough to go and, you know, collect those little $100 commissions, $50 commissions when they can, just because, you know, they're hungry enough. The next thing I want to talk about is a little bit of a shameless plug with a company that I work with, and that is LeadFi. So LeadFi is quite literally like a game changer. I will probably make a full video about LeadFi just because Douglas has done a lot for me and we work together on a pretty close basis at this point. But essentially what LeadFi does, and this is so good that I literally thought it was illegal the first time it was pitched to me, is as soon as you collect someone's name, email, and phone number, whether that's on a webinar opt-in page or a Typeform application, it pulls their real credit score, annual income, debt to income ratio, and a bunch of other financial metrics that are actually accurate and sends them directly into your CRM and into your Slack channel. So the reason why I'm bringing this up in a video about paid ads is think about how much power comes with knowing that. I'll give you some real use cases of it that I'm using on a daily basis with all my teams. And just for the record, I make LeadFi a requirement. Like, I will not work with the team if they do not have LeadFi because of how helpful it is for me. So for example, every time I launch ads to a new funnel, I have Slack notifications that are pinging me. Basically, the way it works is I'll have a notification that says, hey, new call just came in from X funnel. Here's the credit score, here's the debt to income ratio, here's the annual income, etc. So basically what I can see is as soon as I launch a new campaign to a new funnel, I can just see in real time the types of people coming through the funnel. So what that does is it gives me instant feedback as to, are the ads targeting the right people? Is the messaging actually attracting the kind of people that we're looking to attract? And then if not, I'm able to make those pivots and make those iterations in real time instead of expecting to get that feedback from a setter or a closer, which might take, 3 to 5 days longer just to kind of get that feedback loop by the time the setter talks to them and the closer talks to them. Another really important use case for LeadFi is actually just holding your sales team accountable. Like I said before when I was talking about feedback, so much of feedback is reliant on like hearsay. It's like, oh, did the setter think that this person was unqualified or were they actually unqualified? Do I want to trust that my setters are giving me 100% accurate feedback, or maybe was it just the end of a really long day and they didn't really go through their full process on this lead? So what I'm trying to say is when you have actual hard quantifiable data on every single prospect that comes through your funnel, you're able to hold your sales team accountable. Be like, okay, I'm looking at the calendar for today. 80% of the leads look really good on LeadFi. I'm expecting you guys to have a really good day. And that essentially just keeps everyone accountable. For one, they can't just point the finger and say, oh, all these leads are unqualified. And then on the other side of that, I'm not going to go and point my finger at the sales team because I actually know the real buying power of these leads coming through our funnel. So I'll do a little bit more about LeadFi in the future, but if you want to get set up with white glove treatment and a little special bonus, you can feel free to DM me on Instagram. Just put the word LeadFi somewhere in your message and I'll connect you with Douglas personally. Okay, so now that we're through the prerequisites, let's get into the actual principles that you need to know to scale your info product ads to 10K a day and beyond. So principle number one is to know your numbers like the back of your hand and be ruthless about meeting these. So I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but essentially all scaling paid ads is just a math equation and you run little science experiments to make the math work. Really, what I mean by that is your entire success with paid ads is just dollars in and dollars out. How much money did you put into Facebook and how much money did you get out? And basically the reason why I'm trying to make such a big emphasis about knowing your numbers is that I'll talk to people who are unprofitable with their ads and they'll be like, yeah, I'm unprofitable. I don't really know why. And it's because they don't have clarity about these numbers. So what we do for every single client we launch is we kind of map out our worst case scenario, a tolerable scenario, and our best case scenario. And essentially in the beginning, we're kind of expecting to be somewhere between these two just because we don't have a lot of data. Pixel might not be properly optimized. We don't know exactly what's going to work in terms of messaging, etc. But as we scale, we're kind of trying to get out of this yellow territory and into the green territory. And the reason why it's so important to know all of these scenarios is because just because you're somewhere around your tolerable case scenario, it doesn't mean you just turn your ads off. Like, I'll kind of get to this in a second, but you really want to work towards this best case scenario. But the thing is, as long as you're profitable with paid, and I'll talk about some scaling principles later, you want to kind of just scale as far as you can. Obviously, there's nuance. But the reason why it's important to know all three of those scenarios is just because you're not, in this scenario and you might be somewhere in this yellow scenario, it doesn't mean you just turn your ads off. There's little tweaks that you can make to kind of get it into the green. That's why it's important to know the numbers that go into each of these scenarios. So that way you can say like, okay, my cost per call is like 225 today, but all of these numbers look good, so I'm still going to let my ads run. Whereas like if you only made judgments based off of this cost per call number, as soon as it starts creeping up into that 225 range, you start freaking out and turn the ads off. Whereas like in reality, you could just pull up some of these other stats potentially and kind of compensate for having a higher cost per call. So point I'm trying to make is you need to map out all these scenarios and you need to be constantly checking these scenarios. So what I do is I have a recurring meeting every single week with all of our clients, and essentially on that meeting every single week we're going to look at our numbers for the past 7 days and kind of compare it and figure out where we're falling in these numbers. So what that does is it keeps everyone on the same page. Marketing, sales, everyone in between is all going to be cognizant of exactly where we fall and kind of what the action steps are to get us back hopefully towards this green scenario. Okay, so the next principle number 2, is kind of an extension of this, but it's just being able to visualize data and understand what is going wrong when. So essentially, this is the way I see it visually. So first you have your front end stats, and then you have your stats within the funnel, and then you have your back end stats. So this is all obviously just for like a call funnel, just to give the example. So on the front end, you're going to be mainly looking at your CPMs, your click-through rate, and overall the lead quality. Like just in general, the kind of people coming through your funnel. Obviously, for lead quality, something like LeadFi helps a lot because you can get actual quantifiable data. But essentially, if these stats aren't where you want them to be, here are your responses. So obviously, there's going to be more responses than this. I just try to keep it simple. But in general, if these numbers aren't where you want them to be, you can get new creatives up, you can test new messaging, you can test new targeting, etc. And then you get to your within the funnel metrics. So like for example, for a call funnel, you have your application to booking percentage, the VSL retention rate, your cost per call, your lead quality, etc. And lead quality is kind of just the same thing as here, where if you have something like LeadFi, it's going to help you kind of get an actual pulse on your real lead quality. But if these aren't where you want them to be, your responses could be, potentially scripting out a new VSL, potentially changing the offer positioning, new front-end messaging, etc. And then you have your back-end statistics, which is like the response rate, aka like how many people coming through the funnel do you actually get to talk to from your sales team? What's the show rate? What's the close rate? What's the cash per call, etc. And if these numbers aren't where you want them to be, you can implement a new pre-call process. You can quality check the setter and closer scripts, and you can just keep reworking the front end so that way the overall lead quality and kind of responsiveness and framing of these leads is better. So the main takeaway from this is one, just to like be able to figure out what's going wrong within your funnel and isolate it and actually have responses. So like, okay, my application to booking percentage gets too low. What am I going to go do? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go look at the VSL retention rate. I'm going to go look at how many people are coming through the application. Is there a lot of drop off? And if those two things are both in check, then I'm going to go look at the framing of the leads on the front end. Like, is everything congruent? And if all of that is proper and I'm still not getting the percentage I like, either A, I'm just going to let the stats play out a little longer, or B, I'm going to go change stuff on the front, like potentially the messaging and the ads. And then the other takeaway that I want you to have from this is essentially just understanding how everything flows. So if you do things right on the front end, it doesn't mean that your numbers here are going to be perfect. And it doesn't mean that your numbers here are going to be perfect. But one response that you can have across the board is just going and changing things on the front end to get better lead quality coming through the funnel. Because ultimately, like let's say for example, your ads are speaking to really financially unqualified people. All of these numbers are probably going to be really low. But if you have that data and you can figure out ways to attract a higher quality of lead on the front end, all of these numbers are probably going to be better. So I think you guys can understand why I say that everything is so contextual to your specific situation, just because you really need someone who has kind of been there and done that to know what's going wrong in your funnel. But the point I'm trying to make is that you need to be able to kind of isolate these variables so that way you can try and fix them. Okay, so principle number 3 is creative velocity. Creative velocity is actually really important right now just because of the new Facebook updates. We're kind of doubling, if not tripling, the amount of creatives we're testing every single month, which is obviously a little bit annoying, but at the same time, it is what it is. But point being is that your success with paid ads is largely a creative game. And like we've talked about here, the messaging within the ads is so crucial. So with that being said, here's basically what this process boils down to when it comes to testing ads. So let's say, for example, you test angle A. So like I'll give you an example. One of the ad angles that we're testing is about how this is almost like a better alternative to franchising a brick and mortar mortar business. So for example, if I test that angle and it works, it attracts a high volume of financially qualified leads that are well framed, you double down on this. You start testing more messaging adjacent to it. So maybe I'll just pivot that angle slightly and talk about how this is better than just brick and mortar business. Like I'll just drop the franchising angle and I'll just compare straight up remote cleaning to brick and mortar business. The third thing is you just continue testing messaging completely unique to find the next thing that's going to hit. So what I mean by that is you don't just live and die by this one angle. You're constantly testing new angles. So that way, when this one angle starts to see diminishing returns, you have other angles that you're already testing through. But if I test that angle and it doesn't work, you don't just completely abandon that messaging. You just pivot around it and keep testing more adjacent messaging until you find creatives that hit. So like I said, maybe I'll just compare it to brick and mortar straight away. And then you continue testing the style of ad. So the composition, what I mean by composition is kind of like what's going on in the ad visually, the editing, the sequence of the ads. Like, do you start with social proof? Do you start with a hook? Do you start with some kind of demo? All that kind of stuff. So what I'm trying to say is you can kind of see how this is a little science experiment. So I test this thing. If it works, I have a kind of process to double down on it and then continue finding things that are probable to work based on this result. And if it doesn't work, I have a different process to kind of pivot around it. So again, here's kind of like a generic breakdown for how I test. Obviously, everything's going to be different for every media buyer and everyone kind of has their own little style that they like to do. But essentially, the way that I'm testing right now, at least, is I'll have the creator film a new batch of ads every week. Maybe it's every other week, depending on the person's schedule. So I'll test all of those ads within a CBO. So I'm going to kind of identify the winner within that campaign because Facebook is just naturally going to bias most of its spend towards one or two ads within that campaign. If that campaign is profitable after 10 to 14 days, I'm going to deem that a winning ad. So I'm going to make a note to the client to keep testing adjacent messaging the next week. So like, for example, here's, the ad that's working right now. Let's try and find more angles that are similar to that. I'm going to scale that original CBO that I launched in step number 2. And then I'm going to add that winning ad to a proven winner ABO that also gets a portion of spend. So like, let's say, for example, I'm putting X amount of my budget towards testing new ads. I'm going to put another percentage of my budget towards just scaling existing winning ads on their own. And then basically I just rinse and repeat that process every week or every 2 weeks until you notice diminishing returns. So with that being said, campaigns don't just last forever. Sometimes a campaign will last for a couple weeks. Sometimes it'll last for a couple months. So you just kind of have to have your pulse on everything, just be constantly checking your KPIs and obviously knowing your numbers really well so that way you can make these decisions. Okay, so now that we've talked about the testing process, let's talk about principle number 4, which is essentially just putting all of your focus on one funnel at a time. So now that you understand the fundamentals, it should be pretty obvious that scaling paid ads is quite literally just a numbers game. It's dollars in, dollars out. But in terms of mental models, here's how I think. So the front end is going to be a constant game of just how can I continue getting the cost down while still maintaining a high quality prospect coming through the funnel. After enough iterations, all of your within funnel metrics, if you remember these like middle numbers, all of these metrics should be pretty stable and you don't necessarily need to put a ton of focus into getting them as high as possible. So what I mean by that is you're kind of going to reach a point where maybe you test a couple different VSLs, you test a few different headlines, you mess with the application structure a little bit, all these different iterations you make within those in-funnel metrics, you don't necessarily need to keep split testing them. Like that's not usually the best use of your time or effort. It's usually higher leverage to just fix the other numbers. So like the back end numbers in terms of the sales team stuff and then the front end numbers in terms of getting costs down. So basically just to reiterate, once you test enough iterations, these within funnel metrics should get pretty stable. And at that point, you only need to iterate once they kind of get out of KPI. And then when it comes to the back end metrics, those are going to be a little bit less of a constant just because it has so much to do with human error because obviously it's a sales team, but at a certain point they should stabilize too. So what I mean by this is usually you're not going to get to the point where you get to like a 60% show rate and then all of a sudden it just drops down to 30 and it never comes back. Obviously there are situations where that happens, but what I'm trying to say is usually the front end numbers are where I'm putting the majority of my focus and the within funnel metrics are going to kind of become stable after enough iterations. And then same thing with the back end metrics, but that usually isn't my job anyways. That's usually more for the sales manager. But the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to iterate to the point where each of these numbers respectively are even in a tolerable KPI range. So what I'm trying to say is you're not just going to launch your ads and like everything is just going to work swimmingly. You're probably going to have a scenario where like they start off really bad and you kind of have to iterate to the point where everything is just tolerable. So what I mean by that is just testing front-end messaging until you get to even $200 to $400 calls that are decent lead quality, and then getting your show rate up to like 40% and getting your close rate up to like 20 or 30%. What I'm trying to say is that this isn't usually a quick process. Obviously it can be if you have the right marketer and you have the right kind of infrastructure and team. But what I'm trying to say is you might start off at the point where your numbers are kind of ugly, and you kind of have to do the iterations to get them to the point where they're even tolerable, and then you can start making these little micro adjustments to get them to like your best case scenario if you remember the financial models. So just to reiterate, these numbers are not where you want them to be long term, but these numbers should at least make the numbers work to the point where you're profitable. So what I mean by that is even on your worst day, let's say you're at $400 a call, and then your show rate is like 40% and your close rate is 20%, depending on the offer price and everything in between, that should at least be profitable for you. And then you can kind of make these little adjustments. Because when you first start scaling, you might be at the point where everything's a mess. So you kind of have to just fix these numbers respectively one at a time, and then you can kind of make these micro adjustments to get them to the point where you want to be, which is like a 4 or 5 ROAS and beyond. But then once you get to that point, like I said, it turns into iterating on each of these respectively until they're in a healthy profit KPI range. So at that point, the game turns into choosing the best funnel to scale into, building all the infrastructure properly, and iterate until it's within KPI. So this is like in that tolerable range. Making sure the lead quality is good on the front end, which largely has to do with messaging, making sure that the back end statistics are in check, which largely has to do with your sales manager, and then continue iterating on the front end to get costs as low as possible while still maintaining good lead quality, and then keeping your eyes on that within funnel and back end statistics just to get them into KPI when needed. So I hope this all makes sense. Essentially, all I'm trying to say is that the numbers might start out ugly. You need to do the iterations until they look at least decent, and then from there, it's a lot easier to take it from decent to really pretty, as opposed to just seeing the numbers when they're really ugly and thinking, oh my God, how am I going to get this up to like a 5x? Like I'm barely even profitable right now. It's normal. There's kind of a cycle that happens in terms of iterations. So I know that this sounds easier said than done, but at a certain point, that's all it boils down to. It's really just these steps in order. Go full focus onto one funnel, get it within KPI, make sure it stays there while you get acquisition costs down as much as possible. And then once you've gotten one funnel to the point where it's running at like 80 or 90% of perfect, whatever perfect means to you is, it's time to adopt a multi-funnel approach and start incorporating new funnels into the mix. Okay, so the one preface that I want to make before I get into principle number 5 is that I'm not saying that you have to run multiple funnels. There's plenty of people who get to millions of dollars a month just with one funnel, and that's definitely a viable approach. What I'm trying to say is usually it's my preference to start to branch into multiple funnels, and I'll tell you why in this reason. So principle number 5 is diversifying risk. So over here, I've pulled a kind of bar graph that I found on Google about hedge fund returns. Essentially, the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that they have these outliers, but really all of their returns fall within this median kind of range. And the reason why I'm even bringing this up is that I see an ad account kind of like a hedge fund portfolio. Each campaign is its own little investment, and ultimately the goal is to get the aggregate return of the portfolio as high as possible while minimizing downside risk. So with that being said, this leads to a big argument for diversifying your spend across multiple funnels. Let's talk about why. So what I mean by this is usually it's not my favorite approach to go all in on one funnel, because you're going to feel the volatility of that funnel. There's going to be days where your cost per call is just way too high, the lead quality sucks, show rate sucks, like all these different things are happening. But what I'm trying to say is that if you have some of your eggs in multiple baskets, kind of like how a hedge fund operates, you're going to diversify your risk while also maintaining a good return on your entire portfolio. So what you have to realize is that every funnel reaches a point of diminishing returns. For some people, this is like 10K a day on a funnel. For some people, this is like 20K a day on a funnel, whatever it might be. But if you try and scale past this ceiling, oftentimes you're better off putting spend into other funnels instead of just trying to like break this ceiling with all you've got. So as we've talked about before, every audience has a pocket of people that is more or less receptive to certain funnels. So I'm going to go into depth about this a little bit. So what I mean by this is, if let's just say your goal is to just scale a call funnel to the moon, there's this pocket of people within your audience that just are not going to book a call. They just think it's too abrasive, it's too scary, they don't want to get on the phone with some pushy sales rep. But if you would allocate some of your funds into like a webinar where someone can sit on the other side of the computer, no pressure or anything, and just learn about the offer, they would convert that way. Same thing, let's say there's someone who doesn't meet either of these criteria. They don't want to show up to your webinars and they don't want to book a call with your sales team. But if you put out like a low ticket product and they could kind of sample you for like $20, and then they sample you for $20 and they're like, hey, this was actually really helpful. Like, I think this is something I could pursue doing. That's what gets them to convert. What I'm trying to say is that when you have multiple funnels running and you have all these funnels that appeal to different people within your audience, all you're doing is casting a wider net to where you might be able to convert more of your audience rather than if you just scale one funnel to the moon. So let's talk about what this means tangibly. So let's say your ROAS on a call funnel is at like a 3-to-1 at 10K a day in spend. But whenever you try to spend 15K a day, it drops to 2-to-1. However, if you go and spend that extra 5K a day or 35K a week on a webinar, you bring back 140K, which means that you just found a better place to allocate that spend. But when you try to push that spend on the webinar, you reach another ceiling of diminishing returns. So you go and allocate the rest of your spend into a low ticket funnel. My entire point with this example is it's safer and it's usually more beneficial to diversify spend across different funnels. If you can scale with a multi-funnel approach, you're bringing in more leads that will go and convert in other conversion mechanisms, which means overall scale. So what I mean by this is you're going to bring in people to your webinar who don't convert on the webinar, but they're going to convert through the low ticket funnel. And then you're going to bring in people from the call funnel who don't convert, but they convert from the low ticket funnel. You kind of get the principle. But essentially, it's like having a chair that's standing on 3 or 4 legs instead of just one leg. And all of these funnels that you're running profitably are acquisition pipelines for new leads that are going to come in and convert through other funnels. So the whole point I'm trying to make is that this is kind of one of those scenarios where a rising tide lifts all ships when done properly. So what this turns into tangibly is you dial in one funnel's infrastructure, you spend until you find that ceiling of diminishing returns, you dial in the next funnel's infrastructure, and then you just rinse and repeat. Okay, so principle number 6 is accounting for sales cycles and look back windows. So like earlier in the video when I was talking about, even if you're only at a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1, still try and scale. And the reason why is just because your ROAS is at a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 on a 30-day time frame, leave it running, continue to optimize because of look back windows. So what I mean by this is, let's say today is October 1st, for example, and I'm going to spend 30 grand on ads this month. But my 30 grand only brings me back 60 grand on October 31st. But if I go back in December and look back at all the people who came from my October ads, my ROAS might be higher, like on Hyros, for example, and it might be at like a 4-to-1. And the reason why that is because the sales cycle for info products is a lot longer than something like ecom. Like for example, ecom, like people are always just looking for like, am I profitable on the day? Okay, scale. The reason why this doesn't work for info products is because people need to build up a lot of trust with you to go and transact, and that might take weeks, if not months. Actually, the way that I think about this is you of course want to get your ROAS as high as possible on a shorter time frame, but really you want to be patient in the macro because you know that if you can scale at a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1, you go look back at those ads in 30 or 60 days, it's probably going to be closer to a 4 or 5-to-1. And then obviously the other thing you can do is just shorten your sales cycle with new conversion mechanisms, retention marketing, etc. The more webinars you can run, or the more low ticket funnels you can run, or the more retention marketing you do, you might be able to get someone's sales cycle from 6 weeks to 4 weeks, which just kind of speeds up the profitability of your ads on a longer time horizon. So essentially the takeaway is that ROAS is a lagging indicator. It's not just like because your ROAS is a 2-to-1 today, if you look back at it in 30 days, it's not going to be any higher. No, in most scenarios, as long as you're scaling, it's going to be way higher. And then in my opinion, you scale as hard as you can until you fall down to around a 2 ROAS, and then you optimize for profit after. So another conversation to be had that's kind of like a tangent off of this is sometimes you might actually have too high of profit margins. So let's just say, for example, you launch your ads and you spend 100K and you bring back 600. In that example, your net profit is, let's just say 60% or whatever it might be. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that at a certain point, you continuing to operate your business at such a high profit margin, while yes, it's nice because you're taking home a lot of money, you're actually kind of stunting the growth of your business long term, because if you spent a little bit more, even if it was at a slightly lower ROAS, you're building this snowball of people who are going to convert later down the line. And what I mean by snowball is actually principle number 7, which is what I like to call the snowball effect. So let's talk about what this snowball effect even means. So essentially, when you run a multi-funnel approach and you're constantly scaling month over month, you start to have this effect where you have more and more people in your ecosystem that haven't converted yet. So let's say, for example, the first couple months you start running ads, you have like 1,000 people on your email list or just in your ecosystem in general who know about your product, but they haven't yet converted. And then over time, you spend more and you get it up to 10,000. And then over time, you spend more and you get up to 100,000. What I'm trying to say is that there's a ton of money left in this bucket of people. And really what you want to do is you want to scale until the point where your snowball is getting bigger and bigger. Because then when you go and run like a webinar or you run a challenge or you run a new low ticket funnel, you kind of convert a bunch of people in this snowball. And it's like if your snowball is only this big, you only have a little pocket of people that you can convert. But if you can scale at a healthy profit margin and get your snowball this big, you go and run a webinar and you cut off like a massive chunk of it and you convert a bunch of these people. Or you run a challenge and you cut off another massive chunk of it and you convert all of those people. And then basically the way that you do this tactically is you continue to test new middle and bottom of funnel messaging. So what I mean by that is speaking to people who are already solution aware. So like for example, let's say your business is Amazon and all of the messaging in your ads initially is very like top of funnel friendly. It's like, hey, if you're looking for a way to supplement your 9-to-5 income, here's Amazon FBA. But then as you build up this snowball and you have a bunch of people who have already heard that messaging, you can start to hit them with more middle and bottom of funnel of messaging. And then let's say, for example, after you've run those top of funnel angles so many times, you start to test new middle of funnel angles. For example, the reason why I love Amazon so much is after you scale that first winning product, it's so easy to go and do it on product number 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. What I'm trying to say is that's not necessarily an angle that would appeal to someone on cold if they didn't know what Amazon FBA was. But as you build up this snowball, that might be the angle that someone that within this snowball needs to hear to go and convert. Again, I'm just kind of spitballing these angles, but it's just to prove a point. New conversion mechanisms, like we were talking about with webinars, challenges, live events, ties into that, retention marketing, etc. So as you build this snowball up, your email list will probably generate more and more profit every single month because you have way more people in this snowball. You kind of get the point. So the next principle that I want to talk about is something that's kind of adjacent to the snowball principle, which is essentially like why the snowball principle works. So what I'm trying to say is that here's your prospect, for example, and at this point they've seen your ads a bunch of times because they're deep in this snowball. And essentially the point I'm trying to make is that, like I said before, with sales cycles, with high ticket info products, sometimes people need to have trust built up with you for months, if not years, to actually go and buy. But what I'm trying to say is that when you're testing new middle of funnel and bottom of funnel messaging, kind of just hitting people as many ways as possible once you've defined your ICP, you want to find dozens of ways to speak to them. And essentially what happens is each of your prospect feels like they see your ads everywhere. And they're getting hit dozens of times over with new creatives. And that's happening over weeks or months of time. And they're getting hit with new conversion mechanisms. So like when they first saw you, you were running a call funnel and they were like, I don't want to book a call with this guy. But then they see your ads for a webinar and they're like, damn, maybe I should show up to that webinar. And then with new messaging that hits them from different angles, like I said. So like, for example, if you dial in your ICP and you figure out 50 ways to go and speak with them, you never know. Like maybe angle number 37 is the one that finally gets them over the line. But the whole point of this is, this kind of goes hand in hand with this whole snowball principle, is that as you snowball and as you test new middle and bottom of funnel messaging, this is kind of what gets some of these people within this snowball to convert. So just to reiterate, that's often what you need to make a large percentage of people convert. So you need to kind of make it through that valley of despair where, you know, your ROAS might be suffering, you might just be barely profitable, to the point where you can see this happen. So what I'm trying to say is you get this snowball as big as possible, you test new messaging to get these people over the line, you launch new funnels to get these people over the line, and essentially you get to the point where, you know, even for a while, maybe you were only running at a 2 or 3x ROAS, you get to the point where you can kind of like profit max and you can just convert a bunch of people by the boatload, whether that's like on a big challenge or you just have a month where you kind of cut back the ad spend. But because you have so many people in this snowball, you know, you still make just as much, if not more profit. You kind of get the point I'm going for. And obviously, I'm not trying to speak too much about this when it comes to scaling, just because, like I said in the beginning of the video, it's super contextual to your offer. It's super contextual to your situation. But with that being said, if you made it to this point in the video, obviously you're interested in scaling paid ads for your offer, for your client's offer. So I would just like to give you an invitation to go and book a call to apply to work with us. So whether you're a growth operator or you're someone running your clients' ads and you just want to learn how to run ads at a higher level, or if you're an info product owner and you want us to do it for you, you can go ahead, click the link down below, apply to work with us and book in a call. You'll be speaking with me directly, and I'd be more than happy to kind of give you a game plan for exactly how we can help you scale your info product with paid ads. But regardless of whether or not you want to book a call or not, I want to thank you for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.